Found it. Okay. And I'm just gonna repeat again for the recording for it's not copyright, but like for the sake of an attribution that this is Rabbi Glickman's scholarship, Elaine Rose Glickman, and I am simply presenting on her behalf. So she shared this is the handout, Messiah and the Jews. This is also the name of her book, which I bought on Kindle but have not begun to read yet, so I can't speak to how like academic or accessible it is. But you're welcome to also check it out if you need more on this topic from her. So she starts here with this quote from Maimonides, Ani ma'amin be'emuna shlema b'yat HaMashiach ve'af al pi she'yitma'eha im kol ze ani ma'amin. I believe with perfect faith in the coming of the Messiah, though he may tarry, even with all this, I believe. There's some stories of this like being turned into a song and being sung or written on barracks in concentration camps and being sung by survivors and things like that. So we're going to talk about that more later, of the like how the Shoah affected Messianic belief. That's at the end of her. We're going linear here. So, but that's, I think most people today who know this phrase, unless they are like rabbis or scholars or, very halachically minded Jews, if they know this phrase, it's probably from that context. Okay, so in the first session, which now feels like a lifetime ago, but it was maybe, I don't know, a month ago, Rabbi Glickman walked us through biblical terms around the Messiah. Messiah or Moshiach in Hebrew just means anointed one. In the Bible, it is used to refer to priests and kings, but also to lepers, just like anyone who needs to be anointed with oil. It does take on a slightly higher level of like weightedness when it's applied to kings Saul, David, and Cyrus. So Saul being the first king of Israel, David being arguably the most important or the greatest king of Israel, and King Cyrus of Persia, who liberated the Israelites or the Judeans from their Babylonian bondage. The Persians conquered the Babylonians, and then King Cyrus let the Jews go back to Israel. And the Bible kind of ends with the building of the Second Temple. So now we're in the Second Temple period. And this is a time of great upheaval, especially toward the end of the Second Temple period. This is in Christian circles, it's known as like the intertestamental period. It's where a lot of the Apocrypha that didn't get canonized, but is still very Jewish in nature, which we studied like a year ago together. A lot of that comes from this time period. There are still Jews living in communities in Babylonia, in Egypt. The diaspora didn't end. It's still pretty concentrated in the Middle East and like Central Asia at this point, but it's still happening.
Right now.
But we are basically, sorry, I'm just gonna, but we're back in Israel in some manner of autonomy. In this period, the vision of the Messiah goes from a redeemer of Jews to a redeemer of all people, a defeat of the wicked to a defeat of wickedness, and a representative or, um, you know, I guess again, redeemer of Israel to the universe. There are a few reasons that this happens. I'm gonna stop sharing. You don't need to stare at that for so long. But just to there's a few reasons that this happens. Some of it is like um because again, now we're living in a more multicultural world, right? Like we're still in diaspora. We are back in our homeland, but there are other people living alongside us. The Israelites or the Judeans who returned had to confront the Israelites and Judeans who never left, and like the way that Judaism evolved for each of those pockets of Jews in the 70-ish years of exile. It's different. And we saw some of that when we studied the book of Ezra, that there's like clashes. So there's a lot happening that the theologians, I guess, of the time are kind of like, I don't know that I believe anymore that one person, a human, right? Because in the biblical period, Messiah is unequivocally, completely human. No divine, I mean, divinely chosen to lead, but no divine attributes in themselves. And so now they're kind of like, how is one human going to unite this people that's now spread across the world, what they know of as the world at that point, right? And of different, starting to have different practices and different beliefs and things like that. So it's difficult. And then, and then the Romans conquer and it's even worse and there's violence and everything. So this really takes off after the Bar Kokhba um, revolt. So Bar Kokhba happens in the 2nd century CE, around 132-ish. So this is after there's already been a series of like what I would say are false messiahs around the end of the Second Temple period and the beginning of the like immediate post-Temple period. In Reza Aslan's book, Jesus of Nazareth, which is like an attempt at a historical unearthing of the character of Jesus, the human, the person of Jesus. He talks about how there were like 4 other men from Galilee, like all from the same, not just, I mean, Israel's not that big to begin with, but like from the same neighborhood, who all claim to be the Messiah at the same time. And we're doing various things of trying to, overthrow the Roman oppression and do the things that at that time was what Jews still believed the Messiah would do. That again, like this move to divinity and to like universalism was like in the works, but it hadn't fully happened. So right now, or in around 30 CE, they're looking for a person who will liberate them from Roman bondage and reestablish full Jewish autonomy in the Holy Land. When that fails, and then another man rises up, Bar Kokhba, 100 years later, and fails again in a like really brutal, like the Romans like raise the community again. I mean, they'd already destroyed Jerusalem. Like, how much more could they do, you would think? But they killed a lot of people, not just the rebellion, the rebels. Rabbi Akiva notably believed that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah as well, and that's partially like when he failed, what made him lose it a little bit. Even though, I mean, that's my read of him. The story of the 4 rabbis that enter Pardes, Rabbi Akiva is the only one who comes out whole but why did he enter Pardes? Like, why did he go seeking the world to come before he had actually died? Well, because his Messiah failed and he was freaking out. So this is where it really starts to develop. And so there's kind of two splits from that. When the Bar Kokhba revolt fails and when Bar Kokhba proves himself to be again another failed Messiah, that a person is not going to liberate them from Rome. So one strain focuses on the superhuman aspect of the Messiah, that like, okay, a person's not going to do it. A rebellion is not going to do it. Maybe we need a divine being that's going to come and liberate us all, the whole world. And we won't need to overthrow the shackles of an oppressive government because there will be no more government and there will be no more shackles and there will be, everybody will be happy. And then the other side of things, what you see more of in the Talmud, although there are both in the Talmud, but like you got your kind of proto-mystics over here and then your halachic rationalists over here saying like, let's just not worry about the Messiah. Let's just focus on what we can do right now. And so that's where we get the quote, which is often shared at Tu B'Shvat: if you are planting a tree and you hear that the Messiah has come, finish planting the tree and then go and inquire. That's from Avot de Rabbi Natan, which is actually not from the Talmud. That's a midrash halacha from the same time period. But anyway, and so as Rabbi Glickman notes in her notes here, while we often quote that at Tu B'Shvat to talk about the importance of planting a tree, actually the context for Rabbi Natan, probably didn't actually write it himself, but is to emphasize the primacy of this world and its obligations and to de-emphasize the Messiah. Although you also could probably in our postmodern Jubu world, you could also read some like Eastern Zen into it, right? Like if you see the Buddha on the road, kill him, he's not the real Buddha or something. There's a koan, a Zen koan that's something like that too. So I guess, but anyway, Rabbi Natan did not know about that. And similarly in another book of Talmudic era Midrash, Rabbi Yossi says, one who attempts to give a date to the end of days has no share in the world to come. But prior to Rabbi Kokhba's rebellion, in a different place of the Midrash or the Talmud, Rabbi Yossi had endeavored to calculate the date of the Messiah's arrival. So you can see that Bar Kokhba's failure, really, that was a huge turning point. So now they're starting to get into this concept of the Messiah as a divine being and a universal redeemer. Back to the handout. Now we're going to move time periods a little bit. So the elite response, the apocalyptic response. So I guess the elite response is the rabbis, the more rationalists, right? The apocalyptic response then starts around, like I said, there's some of that in the Talmud. It starts around the same time, but it really takes root in the early medieval period. And it's hard to know who the authors of these works or these theologies really are because they're all pseudepigraphal, meaning they're attributed to much older people. Like they're attributed to having been written by Abraham himself or things like that. And sometimes other earlier rabbis that are still almost as unbelievable because they'd been dead for so long by the time the manuscript was found. But like the ones claiming to have been written by Abraham and Moses are pretty like dead giveaways. Um, so, but this is where they start to read the some of the prophecies in a literal way. Isaiah, of course, is like, I mean, this is the most famous one, but there's a couple from Isaiah that are very famous because of how they are used to prove the messianic prophecy for Jesus. Anyway, I don't want to get into that, but the apocalyptic Jews at this time believed basically that the Christian analysis of these prophecies was correct, just attributed to the wrong person. So then they start waiting for this figure similar to the idea of the Messiah that has been propagated by Christians, that this is, a sort of divine being that will destroy wickedness, and then every being in the world will be vegetarian and so blissful, and there will be eternal peace. Somewhere in this section is also like the death of death concept that Neil Gaiman talks about that's the name of his book, The Death of Death, but that's about the world to come specifically, but it comes with the Messiah, that when the Messiah comes, there will be no more death. And everyone will just live in this like peaceful eternity. And it also starts, this is like the beginning of the apocalypse, like the clash of the world to come, that like before the world to come comes, there will be this like war between good and evil, which again, like it feels it feels vaguely Christian. Like it's something that clearly, I don't know the history of like the four horsemen of the apocalypse and the things like that maybe come from Revelations or come from later teachings based on Revelations, but this is sort of like the Jewish version of that, that's starting to make its way into Jewish belief. Rabbi Glickman doesn't get super into where the apocalyptic theologians are coming from. They're coming from the failure of the human messiahs to liberate from oppressive empires. They're coming from the fear and anxiety of being a diasporic people and living under foreign rule, even in their own land. They're coming from a need, like to believe that God is going to come for them and redeem them the way we read about God redeeming the Israelites from Egypt. But why this is the move specifically, in response or like in juxtaposition of the more rationalist response that some of the other early rabbis were taking. Actually, I guess she doesn't give any theories for either of them, like why that drove people one way or the other. But I think it's hard to ignore the influence of Christianity on the development of Jewish views of the Messiah. She's a scholar on this, so again, like maybe she gets more detailed into it in her book. This is my speculation, but the fact that these ideas of a divine being who will liberate the whole world, these readings of Isaiah, they come not only after the belief of Jesus being the Messiah, but after the establishment of the Christian church. I mean, if we're now some of it begins at this, like I said, around the same time, but it doesn't really take hold to medieval Europe. I mean, that's prime Christian dominance of the world. So that to me feels like there's clearly cultural borrowing happening there, which we don't often like to admit that we do that in Judaism because we're the oldest monotheistic religion. We came first, but we still engage in that as much as everybody else of borrowing other beliefs. Um, so there were some of these apocalyptic readings of Isaiah and Daniel found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So like I said, some of it does go like way back, but it really takes hold a little later. Then we've got the Sefer Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel is a biblical character. Let's go back to the handout here. So, he is a king of Israel. It is to him that the prophet Zechariah is speaking to. It's not in here, it's in the other note, but the not by might and not by power. The Haftarah for Shabbat Hanukkah comes from the book of Zechariah, and Zechariah is talking to King Zerubbabel. But Sefer Zerubbabel is an apocryphal book from a little bit later about that king. It starts to introduce the idea of Messiah ben Joseph. Here's where I'm still a little confused about her notes, is that when I hear Messiah ben Joseph, I think of Yeshua ben Yosef, Jesus. It appears here that we're talking about Joseph like with the coat. Sometimes in prophecy, in Jewish prophecy, like in the Nevi'im, Israel as a collective, especially when they are being praised, is referred to as Ephraim, which is one of Joseph's sons in Genesis. So it appears that in the Apocrypha, they are waiting for an Ephraim Messiah from that line. But a little unclear. Hephzibah is the wife of King Hezekiah. And hold on, let me switch to her notes. Sorry. So an angel in this story, an angel refers to Zerubbabel, how history will unfold year by year until the Messiah arrives. Included in these supposed glimpses into the future are references to the Second Temple's ruin and Rome's ascendance. Okay, so because it's called Sefer Zerubbabel, as though it were written in the time of King Zerubbabel, before the destruction of the first temple. It's giving these prophecies, but the manuscript found, the oldest one, is from the 7th century CE. So it's probably written after these things had already happened. But anyway, in the prophecies, it talks about Rome's ascendance. There's a lot of using Rome as an allegory for Christianity. And in the seventh century, that's a tense time. So there's animosity between the religions at that point. The angel in the apocryphal book summons is summoned to a house of disgrace and is shown a statue of Mary, wife of Belial, mother with Satan of Armilis. So uh, in this apocryphal text, it appears that maybe the author is speculating that Jesus is not, in fact, spawn of Mary and God, but spawn of Mary and Satan, which is an interesting concept because in Judaism, Satan is like not a guy, not a singular person, or fallen angel or whatever. But and then anyway, then it goes on describing what this like false Messiah will look like. But again, like in her notes, it, it's a little wait, where's the thing about Ephraim? Oh, maybe that was in a different section. So maybe this is just about Jesus. There's some other part though where Messiah ben Joseph is referring to a Jewish Messiah from the line of Ephraim. Again, as I was saying, Hephzibah is the next thing on her handout, is the wife of Hezekiah. And she sort of is seen in Sefer Zerubbabel. She appears to be a personification of Israel in the redeemed era and the mother of the Messiah. What the idea of a woman representing Israel as a collective is biblical as well. In the Book of Lamentations, there's a lot of and some in Jeremiah, some of the prophets around the time of the destruction of the first temple, there's a lot of description of like Israel as a cheating woman, a cheating wife, or a disgraced woman, or things like that. So the idea that now like this wife, this faithful wife of one of the good kings of Israel or of Judea, represents like the mother of the Messiah, and Israel restored is part of like the larger arc that they're still building on from the Bible at this point. Okay. So 7th century views of the Messiah, little confusing, clearly antagonistic of the concept that Jesus is the Messiah, but we're still leaning toward the idea that the concepts around the Messiah as a universal redeemer are becoming more Jewishly accepted. So then next on her handout here, we've got the triumph of God and the birth pangs of the Messiah. So the triumph of God is again an apocryphal work of the time, I guess. She doesn't put a time period here, but it's early medieval period. And talks about it fleshes out a little bit more the concept of Elijah, and how Elijah will be the forerunner to the Messiah. So in the Bible, Elijah's an anointed one, right? So he is a Messiah in that sense. he ascends directly to heaven on his chariot. He does not die. So because of that, in the Talmud, he occupies this unique place where he like can come to and from heaven and earthly realms, and solve disputes. And occasionally he'll say things like, you'll know the answer when the Messiah comes. It's vague. What does that mean in the Talmud when the Messiah comes? Seems to depend on which rabbi is speaking, but that's the beginning of that link between Elijah and the Messiah. And then it appears that this work, the triumph of God, begins to solidify that more, that Elijah will be the forerunner, and that all Messiah is subordinate to God, that the Messiah will sit on the right hand side of God's throne or whatever. There's like that image, and Elijah on the left and whatever, but ultimately it's still up to God, that whatever divinity is imbued in the character of the Messiah by this time period, we're still very uncomfortable with the concept of like God embodied, or God's love child or whatever, that like divinely imbued with strength and redemption power, but still like mostly human, at this, according to this work. And then the birth pangs of the Messiah was the next thing on her on the handout, but there's not much on the handout there, but it talks about she quotes Deuteronomy and then the Jerusalem Talmud to talk about this development of the linking of like the violence that precedes redemption, and that there will be pain before there is peace. Like the pain of childbirth is the link there, right? The birth pangs of the Messiah, that they're like before the bliss, there will be strife. And part of what they seemed to talk about was that like this addresses the questions of like who will be redeemed by the Messiah, and the need for repentance. And so in the time of tumult that foretells the Messiah is coming, and that like final war between good and evil, those kind of sitting in between have an opportunity to repent and join the right side. She says, this, of course, was also very challenged, though, by contemporaries, because that concept makes it very easy in any time of tumult, any time of like socio-political upheaval, which the Jews have lived through a lot, makes it easy for a false Messiah to rise up and say, I will redeem us from this situation. And so, I don't know, she at the end, the last note there is, apocalyptics dealt with it as well or better than the elites, making it descriptive rather than prescriptive, which I'm not entirely sure what she means by that, because it would seem to me that this is the whole belief here is still in line with the apocalyptics and not the elites. So I'm not sure what she means there, but and then her next section is on the concept of the changed universe. So at some point in this journey that we've been on, from the Second Temple period through the early medieval period, as these ideas of a divine Messiah are taking hold, this concept of the Messianic age, as it were, is established. some of this is very old. Um, well, Nachmanides is early medieval period anyway, but we've got Midrash Tanhuma is older than Nachmanides, not as old as the Talmud, or the classical Midrash, but it's, I don't know, 8th, 9th century, something like that. Um, Bava Batra is the Talmud, Sanhedrin's the Talmud. Mechilta, I think, is about the same time period as the Tanhuma. So these are still old concepts, but a lot of it was believed to be uh, metaphorical until it wasn't anymore, you know? Um, as happens, I guess, sometimes with like lore or things that are taught for a particular pedagogical reason, and then as society moves forward and you maybe lose that origin and all that's left is the story, and um, then it becomes fact instead of understood allegory. Um, that seems to be what sort of happened here with some of the messianic age, and the concept of the beast lying down with the lamb, etc. Similarly, I'll come back to the resurrection and the feast of the righteous. But similarly, the suffering servant, and this is also from Isaiah and often quoted as proof of the prophecy of a like human divine combined Messiah. But it was believed. Does she write it here? No. But it was widely understood to be the suffering servant was Israel. It was the collective. It wasn't a person. Um, and it that we were the suffering servant, um, being punished by God for failure to uphold the mitzvot, but also, being kicked around by the bigger nations of the world. And that eventually through that process, we would be like redeemed and we would be the light unto the nations, right? So the concept of this referring to a person, to a Messiah, developed later. And again, it appears from her notes, particularly, that it came into belief in Judaism like significantly after Christianity had taken hold and was already using these texts to prove Jesus was the Messiah. So it's like we still didn't buy that Jesus was the Messiah, but we're starting to buy their reading of our ancient texts that for 1,000 years we read completely differently first. So that was, I wanted to get to that next because it felt relevant to this concept of the Messianic age. But then the next thing is the resurrection of the dead and the feast of the righteous. Now, this is a little bit more specifically Jewish. Her quote here is just from the second blessing of the Amidah. Tell you, מי כמוך בעל גבורות, ומידו מלך ממית ומחיה, ומצמיח ישועה. That's that. You would, if you recognize that from Tefillah. So the Amidah is written pretty early. More or less, I mean, it was changed over the years, but more or less that comes from the Talmud. And it's uncomfortable. So in the traditional Amidah, who resurrects the dead, is literal. It's Mechaye Hametim. In our version, in the Reform prayer books, you will read Mechaye Hakol, so that it's who resurrects everything, and it's meant to be more metaphorical. Similarly, in the Reconstructionist books, it's Michaye Kol Chai, who resurrects everything that lives, and again is meant to be more metaphorical that, or not, sorry, not resurrects, gives life. When you take out the dead part, the resurrect is less implied. The verb is to give life. So, but the Hametim, that resurrects the dead, is from the Talmud. So that's a pretty old concept that is like connected to the Messiah and the Messianic age, but does not appear to be a direct result from. I recently finished reading Simcha Raphael Paul's book on Jewish views of the afterlife, and that book is pretty academic. It's difficult. It was difficult to get through. I don't know that I would necessarily recommend it, but it was a very good linear walk through the development of Jewish views of the afterlife, including the world to come. And so there's obviously overlap between concepts of the world to come and concepts of the Messianic age, but they're actually kind of distinct things. So even before the concept of the Messiah as a divine universal redeemer had fully taken hold, the idea that God will resurrect the dead in the world to come, and that there will be like a Gan Eden, like a paradise on earth situation, did already exist. I guess that goes back to that concept of the triumph of God from that other apocrypha, that like whether or not we have a Messiah, we still have God. Like that God is God and will resurrect the dead and could make peace on earth if God so chose, and might do that through a divinely imbued person and might not. And even if God did do it through a divinely imbued person, it's still coming from God. So, so the resurrection of the dead was one of the 13 principles of faith as well from Maimonides. And there's like controversy with Maimonides, who suggested sort of that it might be metaphorical, and then he was almost excommunicated. And so then he was like, no, I mean something else. Like I forget what his excuse was. It had to do with what happens to the soul when you first die versus what happens at the end of days, that he like clarified. So he did not get excommunicated, but it was a big deal that a belief in the resurrection of the soul. And I obviously, because we started with that quote from Maimonides, that one of his other 13 principles of faith is belief in the Messiah. So by that time, the Messianic age had taken hold, but it was still being argued about. That was okay to argue about the nature of the Messiah. It was not okay to argue about whether or not God will resurrect the dead. So they're connected but distinct. This is why Jews don't do anything to the body, right? Like why Jews don't cremate, Jews don't embalm. You're buried in a white linen shroud in a simple casket facing toward Jerusalem. I think her notes say facing east, but that's for us because we are west of Jerusalem. If you were buried in Iraq, you would be facing west, toward Jerusalem, with the bit of soil from Israel, preferably from the Mount of Olives. That's a lot of Jewish funeral homes will give you like a little pouch of dirt from the Mount of Olives. All of that at its core, or in its origins, was about allowing the body to be prepared for eventual resurrection. And that and that the body would resurrect in Jerusalem. Now, how that happens, there's some interesting midrashim about that. We're not going to get into, but basically your body just shoots through the core of the earth. It pops up. That's why you have to be facing toward Jerusalem so that it shoots in the right direction. Anyway, so that's related. Okay. And then we get we're gonna run short on time, so I'm gonna cut a little bit the mysticism stuff because it's not that different from the apocalyptic stuff from 300 years earlier. But so now we're gonna get to modern times. So classical Reform Judaism has in its Pittsburgh platform of 1885, that's the Trefo banquet. That's like the famous like establishment of Reform Judaism in America like moment. Says, we recognize in the modern era of universal culture of heart and intellect the approaching of the realization of Israel's great messianic hope for the establishment of the kingdom of truth, justice, and peace for all. We expect neither a return to Palestine nor sacrificial worship under the sons of Aaron. We reject as ideas not rooted in Judaism the beliefs both in bodily resurrection and in abodes for everlasting punishment and reward. So eventually, obviously, a lot of this relaxed, like a lot of things in Reform Judaism that in its 19th century and early 20th century origins was like very assimilationist minded and very rational minded. A lot of actual Judaism was taken out of classical Reform Judaism and then added back in the mid 20th century. Eugene Borowitz, who I think was president either of the HUC or CCAR in like the 80s. He was hugely influential in things like reincorporating a lot more Hebrew back into Reform services and encouraging keeping Shabbat in some fashion or keeping kosher in some fashion, wearing a yarmulke and tallis at services, things like that had been like, you know, in the first half of the 20th century and certainly in the 19th century, if you walked into a Reform synagogue wearing a kippah, they'd be like, ugh, fresh off the boat. Like it was gauche. So that stuff, so as that stuff reinserts itself into Reform Judaism, so does some of the theology as well. The comfort with accepting more supernatural beliefs about God, the world to come, possibly the Messiah, although that does remain, I think, that the current general belief among Reform Jews is that the Messiah is not a person. The Messianic age is what we make it. And that's sort of where we find the redefinition of Tikkun Olam, which in its origins was a sort of mystical term about anytime you do a mitzvah, not just a good deed, but any commandment, every time you light Shabbat candles, every time you pray at, appointed time, the correct prayers, you are piecing together the broken shards of God, that when God created the universe, God had to shatter God's self to make space. And that every time you do a mitzvah, you put those pieces back together. And eventually, when all Jews follow all the mitzvot, the Messiah will come. That's sort of, it's a it's based in like pretty ancient Kabbalah. I think the explanation I just gave it is pretty Hasidic. Like that's why Chabad is always trying to get people to like wrap tefillin or take home Shabbat candles because they literally believe that that's how the Messiah comes. Um, but the redefinition, as we know it now as liberal Jews, does come from this more like metaphorical idea around the messianic age that we can make the messianic age ourselves through these acts of repairing the world in a physical way. And it does, her last section here is a little bit more like talking about other movements as well on this topic, and that generally outside of like Hasidic circles, modern Jews are uncomfortable with the concept of the Messiah. They're uncomfortable with they tend to be uncomfortable discussing theology at all, especially so-called liberal Jews, the non-Orthodox Jews. But one of the quotes she has here is even almost all Jews today don't discuss it. That is true even of the modern Orthodox. Stephen T. Katz, who I assume is a modern Orthodox person. That so like there's so much more focus on Jews of basically any level of assimilation, anyone who's not living in a Satmar isolated community, to be more rational minded, to believe science, to these things. And even if we believe in a higher power, there's something about the like divine human mashup of the messianic character as it has developed in the last, I'll say 1500 years, that is just really uncomfortable, I think, for a lot of modern Jews across the spectrum of ritual practice. That makes it difficult to discuss. And that's why we just don't in Reform Judaism. If we're being totally honest, it's not because we don't have a theology of the Messianic age or the world to come or the life after death even. We have this concept that we just don't focus on it because the world now is so much more important. And that's true. That is the theology of the Reform movement. But it's not because, that's not to say that there is a lack of writing or belief. It's that discussing those beliefs are uncomfortable for people. And so that's kind of where we're at now. She has one last section called Where Can We Go? But before I get into that, I know Mario at least had some questions, and if anyone else has questions about what I've said so far, I will do my best to answer them. You're muted though, Mario. You have to. Still can't hear. There you go. Okay.
Yeah, you sent us what do I call it? What do I call it? A little folk tale, for want of a better word, about a rabbi being paid a kopeck a day for standing in the gates of St. Petersburg waiting for the Messiah.
Uh-huh.
And say to him, Rabbi, so that's such a low rate of pay. And he says, yes, but it's a permanent job.
Yes.
So there's no, so really that fits into what you just said about doing mitzvah, doing good works and trying to repair the world. It makes that the Masonic age, am I trying to say? Or makes that well, you go ahead, Rabbi, you know what.
Yeah, well, I think the joke there is that rabbi doesn't believe the Messiah is coming, right? It's a permanent job. But yes, I mean, the point of jokes is that they're quippy, right? There's whatever, but I do think it fits then with that theology, as you said, that when we do our own acts of good works and we repair the physical world, we make our own messianic age. But I mean, the crux of the joke, though, right, is that he accepts the money, that he accepts waiting for a Messiah, whereas a Reformed Jew would not, right?
Well,
A Reformed Jew has to go out and do the acts.
mhm. Okay. Am I taking time if I ask a second question?
Go ahead.
Um, where will my being go after my death? My soul, my body, my remembrance? Is it within the realm of Judaism, Reform Judaism, or any other classification of Judaism, to say that it'll go back as a spirit into the wind, into the amber grain, into the snow, the sunlit snow? Well, I might as well say the little poem that I said. It won't take a long time. Okay, here goes. It's this poem that I recited during yesterday's Friday's service. Do not stand at my grave. Do not stoop in my grave and weep. I am not there. I do not sleep. I am the rushing mountain air that blows. I am the amber lit glint, the sun glint in the snow. I am the Kansas amber grain. I am the sunflower standing in the rain. And when you hear the upward hush of the flock in a gush, I am the receding starry sky. I am the receding starry sky. I am the receding starry sky. Do not weep for me. Do not weep for me at my grave. I am not there. Do not cry. I did not die. That's anonymous, by the way, or at least I don't know the source. But how close is that to what Judaism believes?
I mean, Judaism has a lot of speculation. There's no, I mean, as much as there's no dogma at all in Judaism, right? Like we're a culture of arguers. I think that's extra true when it comes to the concept of life after death, particularly to the individual soul. So there is sort of a separation in, I mean, obviously, again, like the concepts of how the messianic age and the world to come are intertwined, but they're distinct. Same goes for the concepts of what happens to the individual soul immediately upon death and what happens to all of our souls at the end of time. Which like there has to be a connection there, right? Because if the soul is eternal, then something is happening between when you die and when the end days come. But they're separate disciplines. I'm not sure how to say it, but they tend to have different like theologies around them. So in classical Judaism, as I said, like for Maimonides' time, resurrection of the dead at the end of days was of utmost importance. As much as anything can be dogmatic, at that time it was. What happened in between when you die and when that happens is less clear or less agreed upon. But I guess I would say they would have felt that concept of the soul being sort of absorbed into the universe would make it difficult to be resurrected. That usually the concept was more of a purification period, and then like sort of limbo or purgatory while we wait for the end of days to come. Some mystics believe in reincarnation. So your soul recycles until it's ready for the end days. So I suppose that's not that different. I mean, it's still a recycling of the soul, right? To go into the universe. But the other thing is, yeah, you asked if that could fit in with a Reformed Jewish theology, and of course it can. I mean, you're a
Yes.
Reformed Jew, and if that's what you believe, and that's a Reformed Jewish belief, right?
I'm
Like,
very comfortable with that. I'm very comfortable with that, with the little poem.
yeah.
I'm
So
very, very comfortable with it. Yeah.
yes,
And I was gonna ask you, am I still a Jew?
yeah, you have my stamp. Mom, you look like you're trying to jump in too, but you have.
So in our limited ability to understand all these things, we think of time as linear.
Mhm.
So when somebody dies, couldn't it be that their soul goes into the end of times and the Masonic age for them? Like there's already an existence beyond our ken. When you die, you go to it, hopefully. And then maybe someday everybody goes to it. But yeah, I think you know what I'm saying, like a time warp.
Right. Yeah, I think that seems reasonable as well. As reasonable as any of the other theories.
So here's my theory. We get recycled and become Adirondack chairs made out of.
I would prefer to be I would prefer to be a can't think of the word.
Seagull.
But an Outer Banks hammock.
Okay.
Okay.
You know what? We're liberal. You can be what you want. How about an echinacea flower?
Or a duck.
A duck.
Yeah, I like ducks.
Yeah. It's a good day for a duck.
Rain.
I don't know how it is down there, but it certainly was here.
It's been raining most of the day.
Yeah.
We might have ducks in the pond later today.
So, Rob, I have a question. How does cremation
Yeah.
come into play at all? I thought Reformed Judaism was now more accepting of that. And how does that all fit?
It is. So, because, as I said, although a lot of things of traditional Judaism made their way back into Reformed Judaism, belief in the Messiah as a person and belief in bodily resurrection has not really come back into fashion. And so the concept of avoiding cremation for the sake of resurrection has kind of passed. There's also the argument that if God, in God's omnipotence, can resurrect the dead, why would God not be able to also resurrect someone who had been cremated? Like someone who's been dead for 1,000 years is not in that much better shape than someone who has been cremated. So, like, let's be real. But it is
So
still
if your
the
soul's going to
traditional.
if your soul's going to leave the body, say when you're cremated,
Yeah.
it's leaving before the cremation's done. It's
Oh
gone
yeah,
into
for
the
sure,
next
for sure.
whatever.
The belief is that generally, right? Like this is all non-dogmatic, but the common belief or the, you know, mainstream, whatever rabbinic teaching is that the soul leaves the body immediately upon death. Like the moment the brain waves stop or the breathing stops or whatever, I guess the brain waves, because you can stop breathing and then be revived. So anyway, but the soul leaves the body, but it stays in the area. And that's where we get like spooky folklore, like Dybbuk's, is that if you know, if you're not sitting with the body and saying psalms, or if you're not burying the body properly, that the soul can get confused and stick around and not find its way to heaven or whatever it goes to next. But for sure, it's not in the body anymore. And so if you're doing, like, I still do Jewish funerals for over cremated remains. I do like the pretty normal full set of liturgy. Often not often, I should say, but some of the ones that I have done, they still bury the urn. So we still do the physical shovel thing at the end of the service, which is I mean, that to me is a very important part of a Jewish funeral. It's so good for your psychological like closure. But anyway, so according to the belief as I understand it, if you're still doing all of that and you never leave the body alone until it goes, you know, wherever it's going to go to be dealt with, the soul will make its way to the hereafter, regardless. So it's really just about bodily resurrection.
Thank you.
I did have someone call me. So someone in the area who was no longer a member of any synagogue died and needed a rabbi for the funeral. And then somehow the deceased woman's Orthodox cousin got my number and called me to complain that I would do a Jewish funeral over cremated remains. And I was like, you need to talk about this like with your cousins, because what they do with the body is not my business. I'm just gonna say the prayers, and you know, it's up to them whether or not they cremate the body. And she was like, no, it's your job as the rabbi to convince them not to do it. And then her rabbi called me too, and I was like, well, tell me why you think it's so important. And he was like, Jews do not get, like, he couldn't even say his theology about it. And I was like, well, my understanding is that it's about bodily resurrection. As Reformed Jews, we don't believe in that. So I don't actually have an issue with it. And even if I did, frankly, it's in her will. It's not even like it was the kid's choice. Like it's legally
That's what she wanted.
is my understanding. And like, so the other option is to just not give her a Jewish funeral at all. And I was like, that's like what you think a rabbi should do? So I don't know. It was weird. It was definitely one of the more confrontational moments of my my rabbinate. Unnecessarily confrontational. But yeah, I don't. Any other questions about the Messiah, the end of days?
So I have one question. I guess I have more than one, but so when we finish destroying the planet and, you know, the climate and all that kind of stuff and killing each other in wars, will the Messiah, you know, is that when we're expecting the Messiah to show up?
I mean, that's the question, right? I mean, that's, I think, part of why it's so hard to believe in a Messiah, because why wouldn't he have come by now? Like, we're in such deep, you know,
I'll be back. I'm sorry.
Yeah. That, I mean, it's like the end of Fiddler on the Roof, right? They're like kicked out of their home. They face pogroms. It's this horrible moment, and then and one of the characters asks the rabbi, "Wouldn't now be the right time for the Messiah to come?" And the rabbi says, "Well, we'll have to wait for him somewhere else." And that's the eternal. I mean, that's why the rabbi in St. Petersburg has a permanent gig waiting for the Messiah, right? Like that's the deal.
I
And so
think I,
theoretically, oh, sorry, go ahead.
no,
Tiffany.
no, you go, Rabbi.
Theoretically, we clearly can't wait anymore. We have to be the ones, but it's hard to do that. I mean, like the world is the climate change stuff. I mean, you brought that up. It is very disheartening. It's hard
I mean,
to.
when I was in school in the 70s, we were talking about things that they're thinking, oh, we should do now. Well, why couldn't we have done that 50 years ago and not be in this situation? And, money always overtakes everything else. And here we are.
With all the facts that you've given us, and I apologize for having missed the first few, but if we are repairing the world and the Messiah will come when we finish that job, what's his job then?
Okay, so
That's where I would say, so now you come?
yeah, good timing. No, so okay, so in the mystical idea of repairing the world, you're repairing
Right.
the universe in a metaphysical sense. You're not actually repairing the world as it is. So then the Messiah comes. In the reform sense of repairing injustices and climate change and things like repairing the world in a physical way, the Messiah doesn't come. The Messianic age has arrived because we built it. So the reform view is that like there's no person, there's no Messiah, there's a Messianic age that we are creating.
And the last thing you were talking about was our discomfort with the idea. To me, I think it's more irrelevancy, and maybe in part based on because Messianism is so important to today's Christianity, at least to many, much of Christianity, we're sort of taking another step away from it, that we don't.
Yeah.
That we're doing this, we're not waiting, and
Right.
and we don't think it has already happened because we're here taking care of things.
And
Fine.
it's up to us to do it? Is that,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the reform view would be like theoretically it's up to us as humans, right? Like that we need allies in the work. Reform Jews are 2% of the American population. Reform Jews are, I don't know, 25% of that. We're one of the bigger movements, but when you factor in unaffiliated, whatever, I don't know, like we're still a pretty small percent. So we can't do it alone, but I do also think there is like that concept of a light unto the nations, and like we are the suffering servants. And so like it is sort of our responsibility as Jews to do it and hopefully to inspire others and to get allies, but like it's our job.
like everyone does their part? And
Yeah.
that's all you can do,
Right.
is what you can do.
Is what you can do. Yeah, correct, of course. Yeah.
So the joke is on the rabbi in St. Petersburg who's taking a kopeck. He doesn't need to take the kopeck. He's waiting. He's in a sense he's permanently there because the concept of Messiah is a permanent one where everybody tries to do good and up levels up the world that way. Up.
Yeah,
So it's a joke on
exactly.
that it's more of a joke than
Mm.
teaching.
Right. Lamar, I'm not sure I understand your comment in the chat. Do you wanna comment further?
Oh, I just put that in there because there seemed to be a return of something in many religions and ancient civilizations. They're waiting on Iman, return of Krishna. I'm not sure if they're waiting on a return of Buddha and Zoroaster. It's just a lot of returns to bring peace or some in some form, away to the world through some incarnation of some human being.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess in Judaism, it's a return, to the Garden of Eden. That's the concept of paradise, of the Messianic age, of the world to come that we talk about. That the rabbis talk about is the Garden of Eden. There's midrash that in the Garden of Eden, these things like Isaiah talks about was true, that the only reason Adam and Eve died was because they were kicked out of the garden. If they hadn't eaten the fruit of knowledge of good and evil, they could have lived forever in the garden. And and they were vegetarians, and I guess presumably then also the other animals that we now know of as carnivores were vegetarians, and it was just this like very peaceful place and time, kind of outside of time. Like it was before the world order as we know it had been established, because all of that happens after they're expelled. And so when the Messiah comes, or when the world to come comes, or however you conceive it, it kind of depends on which rabbi you're reading, we return to the Garden of Eden. So it's not as much a return of a person, but a return of a time, a concept, a certain kind of relationship with God. I don't know. So
Well, some folks consider that the Aquarian age. Is that something that Judaism reformed, the Aquarian age?
I don't know that term. Coral.
Aquarian.
Oh, Aquarian. Oh, like the age of Aquarius.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know enough about that. But sure. All right. Well, thanks everybody, and thanks to Rabbi Glickman for sharing her notes.
And thank
hope-
you.
You,
Yeah.
Rabbi Lizz.
Hope this has been illuminating, and I'll see you guys all, I don't know, a couple weeks probably.
Thank
Bye.
you. And
Thank you.
Simon's
Be
brief
safe.
appearance.
What?
I said thank you and to Simon's brief appearance.
Oh, could you see him in the background?
Occasionally.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.